word excruciating actually comes from the Latin word excruciare. And it was a word that the Romans invented to describe death by crucifixion on a cross. Because they had not necessarily invented, but they had perfected this torturous death where any word, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, Roman, Latin word, wasn't good enough to describe that which what was the process of crucifixion. And so this word that we use when we stub our toe or perhaps break a hand while diving for a frisbee, the pain is excruciating, doesn't do justice to that which Christ endured and thousands and thousands and thousands of other prisoners went through. There isn't much historical data about the amount of crucifixions or death by cross that the Romans or even the Persians or different other neighboring civilizations would punish their most treacherous criminals with. But there was at one point, I believe it was 71 AD, where thousands of individuals were crucified. I believe the story says 7,000 humans were crucified in one day. And so this wasn't new to Jesus. It was probably so common that Christ, as he was walking the streets either of Galilee or of Jerusalem or of Rome or throughout the neighboring seas, that he would actually see people being crucified, nailed to a tree to die. The Romans used this method as a way of mocking and, in a sense, scaring off future crimes from happening. And so because they were in this weird tension and relationship with Jerusalem and with the Israelites, they wanted to make sure that an uprising wouldn't occur. And so very often when Israelites were crucified, they would make it as humiliating and as excruciating as possible to deter any uprising from taking place, with the desire to reobtain Jerusalem, the holy city, fully under Israelite control. And so when Jesus arrives on the scene and he starts healing the sick and loving the lost and calling out the Pharisees and the religious elite, if you've been a part of our series for the last couple of weeks, the Bad Boys of Easter, week number 1, I walked through the high priest, Caiaphas, who was so frustrated by this Jesus guy who entered into the scene and started doing his job. Because it was the high priest's job by Mosaic law in the Old Testament and the Old Covenant to heal the sick and the lepers, and to take care of the poor and the impoverished, and to make sure that the laws were being followed. And he wasn't doing that because the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were more a political system at the time than anything representing God. And so they had to get rid of this Jesus guy. And if you followed this series, you know that Judas, one of Jesus' 12 disciples and closest followers, one of his friends, begins the excruciating part of the crucifixion. Think of a time you've been betrayed by a loved one, by a friend, perhaps an enemy even, and the pain that carries with it. Now, Jesus himself, with someone he trusted for the last 3 years, betraying him for what scholars say is probably equivalent to perhaps $600 today, 30 pieces of silver, not much. Not knowing what the Jewish leaders had in store for Jesus, probably assuming he would just be flogged or arrested and then released, but then he was sentenced to death. And that is where our story today picks up. Turn with me to Mark chapter 15. This is what the first gospel recorded writes about this tragic day. Pilate is on the scene with Jesus and Barabbas. The crowd has just called for Barabbas, the prisoner, to be released. And then this is what Pilate says. "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. The religious leaders and all of the crowd shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Why? "What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas, someone who had been arrested for treason and murder and an insurrection leader, to the crowd, and then he had Jesus flogged and then handed him over to be crucified. I want to stop there for just a second. Had Jesus flogged. I want to walk through the history of what this process actually looked like. Because in our English and in our Western influence, we often skip over this passage. But this was one of the Romans' favorite parts of the crucifixion. In fact, this had started officially the crucifixion process. The better way of translating that word flogging, or to be flogged, is actually scourged. And if you understand that word even a little bit, you can just start to cringe a little bit at the difference that flogging portrays to what scourging portrays. You see, the Romans, when they had criminals that were either treacherous or murderous or someone that they wanted to silence, or in a sense, scare off future uprisings from happening, even if they weren't going to kill them by act of crucifixion, they were still going to scourge them because of how painful it was. And so in this process, Jesus was then taken aback. In the scourging process, and from a historical standpoint, they would strip the individual naked because they wanted to humiliate this person. And then they would shackle them to various different things. We have here a scourging post. There's so many different historical depictions of what it may have looked like, but the most commonly used one was about 2 feet tall, where they would lay the naked body over with the back stretched wide, and they would then shackle the wrists and the feet so tightly that it was impossible to move. They would also at times hang them on the post, shackling their wrists and their feet around the pole so that their skin was exposed. And then, one at a time, there would usually be 2 guards in the area that would take place. And depending on the weight of the crime, it could be 10 lashes, or it could be 20 lashes, or it could be 30 lashes. They would take a weapon of choice, often just something to lash, and it was made of leather for the scourging process. And there would be bone fragments or metal pieces or rocks. And when Michael was making this for me, he said, "You can't actually whip anything with it." So I made a full guarantee because I was very grateful he made this for me. Metal pieces. And the point was then, as they would whip onto the bare skin, it would latch inside the muscle, and then they would rip out as much as they could. It's not a pleasant visual, but if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, the movie, very historically accurate. Very historically accurate. The language used in the Greek is this word spira. And so when Jesus was taken back to the praetorium, the area where he would be scourged and stripped naked, the word spira means, that's used in the original passages, means a cohort of 300 to 600 soldiers, okay? And so the language we have in Mark's gospel that I didn't share was that all of the soldiers came down to the praetorium to witness Jesus being scourged. And that spira language means it's probably 300 to 600 soldiers, all gathering around this naked man, mocking, spitting, etc., someone who's just beaten and whipped. And it's often a misconception because of the passage in Deuteronomy that says Jewish law dictates 39 lashes for a severe criminal because one more would kill the guy. But Romans didn't follow that law, and this was Roman punishment. And so again, if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, and if you've been like me, a nerd, and you're trying to count how many times they actually whipped Jesus, and you're like, they passed 40 a long time ago, was probably because they did. They saved the most severe punishments. And so Jesus' body was literally just torn to shreds from this scourging process. And then this happens. Fulfilling the prophecy, if you just want an idea of what he looked like, Isaiah 52, just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. That's what Jesus looked like in the prophecy he fulfilled from the Isaiah passage. And we haven't even gotten to the worst part. Excruciating. So Mark picks up the gospel, 15, 16 through 20. The soldiers then led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. There's that word spira that I shared, 300 to 600 soldiers after the scourging. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews. Hail, King of the Jews." For that is what the Israelites had wanted him killed for. He was claiming to be the Son of God. And so this is then the second part of the flogging. See, Jesus had, at the minimum, taken 39, 40 lashes, probably more. And then they put on this robe and eventually a crown of thorns, and they start striking him again and again and again. And the language here in the Greek emphasizes the continuous striking. Why? Because more times than not, when prisoners of this value were brought into the praetorium, all of the soldiers present got a hit on them. And so at the minimum, if there were 300 soldiers who were there, and they all wanted to get a lick on Jesus, as long as time permitted, they would have been allowed. So they would have struck him with the head and the staff and spit on him, falling on their knees. They then paid homage to him. This is, again, just to mock and humiliate this naked man who they had claimed was the King of the Jews. And when they had mocked him, they took off his purple robe and put his own clothes on him. They led him to be crucified. That purple robe, along with this, is a passage we didn't share. This is probably a dumbed down version of what the crown of thorns looked like. As you study the history, the thorns were probably anywhere from 1 to 3 inches. And so they wrapped it around his head, and then they beat it down into the skull. How Jesus hadn't died up to this point is just a miracle. So he then takes his cross. And some more history for all you history lovers. When Jesus walked out to the crowd after being scourged, he would have been carrying his cross up to that point. They would have already strapped on part of the beams. Cross weighed about 100 pounds in Roman culture, give or take 10. And the prisoners were required to carry their own cross. We have multiple gospel accounts that say that someone actually helped Jesus carry his cross. And so that is just an indicator of how beaten up his body was, because Romans would never make it easier for a prisoner of this value. They were required to carry their cross. They were going outside the city to a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, outside of the walls of Jerusalem. Some scholars believe this place was about a mile. And so even if Jesus is just walking with his body completely beaten and shredded and scourged with his cross, or if he's helping carry the cross, or as one of the Gospels says, carried his own cross, 100 pounds, to the place where he would be killed. Mark 15, verses 25 through 32. This is what Mark writes. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." This was very common for cross barriers. I'm going to jump down here. This is a very English and Western influenced cross, as you can see. Probably doesn't weigh 100 pounds because Michael could carry it by himself. I guess you can lift 100 pounds. You're stronger than that. But what they would do is they would then take the crimes that person committed, and they would nail on the top the essentially what they had done to try to deter future criminals from committing those same crimes. And so when it says that Jesus committed the crime of being the King of the Jews, they wrote it in 3 different languages so that everyone could see it. All the passerbys, as they were walking by, could look at the cross of the person crying out in pain, and they could see, I'm not going to do that. Next verse, they crucified 2 rebels with him. This is the passage Brad talked about last week, with one on his right, one on his left. And then those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." I want to stop there for just a second, because those insults, you have to understand the gospel comes from Matthew. I believe it's chapter 22 or 23, where Jesus is talking to the religious elite, the Pharisees, and he is sharing about, I will destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. We know, as Christ followers, he's talking about his body, talking about the resurrection. 3 days later, Easter. But then we also know, I believe it's 70 AD when the temple falls. And so perhaps he's prophesying as well. Next verse. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." How many of us have asked the exact same thing? That we may see and believe. God, just show me a sign. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Friends, what patience and self-control it must have taken for God to stay on the cross. You see, as they were laid down on the ground, they had just carried their cross. Prisoners would be laid down. Their arms would be stretched wide, and then there would be 5-inch nails, give or take, that would then be hammered into, and here's again another misconception because of some of the language in the Bible. We see our English translation says hands, but in Roman culture, the hand, rather than just being the palm, actually went down to the wrist. And why that's important is because if a 5-inch nail was just piercing the hand, what would happen? Well, it would rip through. So what the Romans discovered was if they put it between the 2 bones of the wrist, it created essentially this gap that locked in the nail into place. But then sometimes they would also tie rope around the wrist and the feet to make sure that they were stuck in position. And so they would stretch their arms out, and they would nail the wrists to the cross, and then they would cross the feet with the toes slightly pointed up, and they would often put a beam at the bottom of their toes. And then they would nail one in between their feet. And they would hang. But they positioned themselves in a way where, because their shoulders often got dislocated when they launched the cross into position and dropped it, they would have to push up with their scourged back. By the way, they're naked doing this. Again, the idea was to humiliate. With their scourged back against the wood, just to be able to get a breath. And then they would go back down, hold it for a couple of seconds, and then go back up. And this was a process that could last anywhere from 3 hours to days. Because the Romans wanted, again, to humiliate and to also deter people from doing the same crimes. So they wanted it to last a long time. Jesus was hung on the cross at 9 in the morning. And after a few hours, asphyxiation starts to set in. That's actually how they died, is not being able to push themselves up on the cross again. And in the middle of all of that, Luke's gospel says Jesus' words are this: Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Father, forgive them. I want you to picture the worst thing you've ever done. And for some of you, that may bring shame. That's not the point of this illustration. For some of you, that may bring much pain. I also want you to think about the worst thing done to you. And yes, I know that can cause trauma to re-trigger. Please tread lightly. Understand that Jesus died for those things. For the sins you've committed, for the sins committed against you, for all the pain, all the suffering, all the loss, all the hardships, all the shame, all the addiction, all the idolatry, all of the choices you've made were on Jesus' back as he was scourged. Second half of that verse, and they divided up his clothes by casting lots. This fulfills the Old Testament prophecy, again, that they would divide his clothes. But it was also something that the guards would do with many of their prisoners. And so they're gambling out in front of him, making a joke of all of this as this is taking place. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Moving on to Mark's gospel. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, if you remember, he was nailed on the cross at 9. 6 hours later, at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? He is quoting a psalm that's almost verbatim. He is speaking probably in Greek or in Aramaic, and so it would have been translated from Hebrew. But he's quoting this psalm where David is writing, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? It's a really famous psalm. And David goes through this lament where he is just crying out to God. And then at the very end, David says, my God, you did not forsake me. You did not turn your face from me. Another misconception that people think is in the Bible is that God turned his face from Jesus, but you won't find that in the Bible. Jesus is just simply here quoting this psalm, knowing his audience, many of them, would remember this psalm that they would have quoted as a kid. My God, why have you forsaken me? But not all of them understood because there was a language gap. And so when some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. He's calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with wine, vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. This is actually the second time he was offered to drink something. This was essentially a painkiller for them. Wine and vinegar, or some translations say gall, it was a painkiller that a group of women actually came up with in Roman culture. They were Jewish, they were Israelites, and they came up with this to try to numb some of the pain. And for whatever reason, the Romans allowed this at this point, because they were already done with their torturing. So someone filled a sponge and then Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. And then with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. And Matthew's gospel says Jesus cried out, "It is finished." a phrase that translates in Greek to tetelestai. It is finished. You know what's fascinating about that phrase, tetelestai? Is that the high priest, when in the temple on the Day of Atonement, if you remember my first sermon for week number 1, the Day of Atonement was actually this day where all of Israel would come together, confess and lay their sins on the sacrificial lamb. The high priest would take those sins, slaughter the lamb, take the blood from those sacrificial lamb, and he would go through the veil, the Holy of Holies in the temple, and he would place the blood on the mercy seat. Okay? This is so fascinating. Don't miss this. Once he was done placing the blood, you know what word he would say, the high priest? Tetelestai. It is finished. And then Israel would be forgiven of their sins for that year. And so what Jesus does on the cross right here is so radical and revolutionary. He's already claimed essentially to be the high priest by just agreeing. And now he once again quotes the high priest language, it is finished, because Jesus himself is the sacrificial lamb for the sins of all people. Mark concludes by saying this: the curtain of the temple was then torn in two from top to bottom. I want to stop there for a second. From 2 to about 3 o'clock in this afternoon, for the nation of Israel, like I said, this was the Day of Atonement. Israel was literally going at the same hour Jesus was being killed on a cross to the temple, and they were bringing their lambs and their unblemished animals to the temple, and blood would be going down the street, filling the streets of Jerusalem with animal. And then the high priest would take that, go through the curtain, which is better translated as veil, the Holy of Holies, go into the seat of mercy. And that veil was what separated God from humanity. Only the high priest could enter that room and be in front of God. Until now. Jesus says tetelestai, he says it is finished, ending the old covenant and establishing the new covenant, which is what we are now under. And it says that the veil and the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Last few verses. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. And I love this. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and of Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up there with him to Jerusalem were also there. Here's how I want to end tonight. It's 7:24. We've got about 5 minutes. Perfect timing. Because we are going to end with communion. As a church, we take communion to remember and to reflect all of what I just shared. Why? Well, Isaiah writes it this way. Chapter 53, verse 3 through 5. Jesus was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. So why do we remember communion and take communion? Because Jesus took upon our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But no, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was placed on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Jesus establishes this practice of the Last Supper of the church taking communion to remember and to reflect and to understand our salvation. So here at Crossbridge, when we take communion, we don't have membership here at the church. We believe that if you are in Christ, if you have accepted Christ as your Savior, and if you understand that communion is about remembering and reflecting on the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Christ that you are allowed to take communion with us.